This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 15 of the Cornell Turf Show this spring, 2022. We're going to have our guest today is Bill Kreuser. He is the president of the Greenkeeper app, and he's also the superintendent of Jim Ager Golf Club down out there in Nebraska. You can follow Bill on Twitter at PGR Bill. He's got a lot of interesting video. He does a lot of extension and outreach and consultant work on Twitter as well. So a good follow for all the things we'll talk about today, I'm sure. But as always, Frank, I'll let you get it started today with as always, our review on the weather. Are we still on the roller coaster? Are we not? You never know.
Forget it, Carl. You know, you were on the conference call this morning. It has been a fascinating run this spring of roller coaster weather. But boy, you know, I want to just say before we get started, golf course superintendents, many of them are exceptional photographers. I just have to say that, you know, I do it so much. I don't give enough credit, but I, you know, just pull these off of Twitter very easily. And it's so wonderful to see pictures like this. You know, this reminds me of everything, you know, you got working on a golf course for, getting up early and getting out there, cutting grass in the dew, no problem seeing your lines. Old guys like me have a hard time seeing their lines without the dew. So I thought I'd put a couple of really funny pictures up. This is the Binkle dog here on the left up in Canada and its first day. Look at the size of those paws. How big you think that dog's going to be, Carl? And then on the right, you got Jimmy Buffett cruising around a golf course in Florida, petting the superintendent's dog. I mean, don't you want to be a dog after seeing some of these pictures? All right, Carl, so get us going. Give us the BMP tip of the day.
Yes, so one of the parts in our project here with the RIT folks, Frank, is addressing nutrient management. And one of our pro tips, it's not even one of the things we looked at in our survey, but just getting your growth rate right. And the idea of a consistent growth rate leads to consistent turf and playability. And our guest, Bill Kreuser, we'll talk about that today with him. But we've, you know, in the past, have we ever measured growth? And what we started doing at the Cornell Golf Course a couple of years ago was actually measuring the clippings coming off of the golf green. So this was the data, the first year we took this data. We did it for 2 different greens. And so you'll notice on this chart, the y-axis is the amount of growth in volume, the clippings per unit area. And you can see a little green range in there. I've got a green square from 10 to 20. This is milliliters per meter squared. This is where the greens performed well. And so in that first year, we were kind of getting some data. Okay, what number are the greens performing well at? That was the range we liked. The problem, as you can see, is that growth very rarely was in that range. The black bars are large precipitation events. Very frequently, we got a big shot of rain and growth would surge. And then it would take us a while to come back down and get back into our green zone. So when we looked at this the first year, we said, okay, we have to address a couple things. One of it was the PGR program we used in the next year. The superintendent, Dave Hicks, now retired, used a different PGR program. He would change his PGR rates. He did a little bit more with the way he irrigated and also doing some cultural practices. So this is the data in year 2. Once he got a little bit of that data under his belt, you could see that same green bar, right, 10 to 20. We spent a lot more time in that ideal range in the 2019 season. And this is a tool that he really liked to use, trying to react to that sort of growth and alter your management practices, responding to, okay, when I get a surge, how do I suppress growth? When I'm a little low, okay, how do I need to do maybe a little more nitrogen, right? So responding to that, getting your growth rate more consistent gives you more playing conditions. And a great way to do that is to measure the growth in the first place.
Carl, before I let you go on this point, how hard was this to do? Why 2 greens? Talk a little bit about the way you went about this, because this is really fundamental to not only our conversation today, but what we think is fundamental to the way you should be managing your playing surfaces.
Yeah, and I think when people hear data, Frank, they think, oh, you know, what do I have to do to get that? And this was literally as simple as having a bucket that's got volume measurements on it. After you mow a green, you take the grass in your buckets on the mower, you dump it in there, you write the number down, you get on your way. It takes less than 60 seconds, really. Now, the reason why we did 2 different greens at Cornell, where there were 2 very different growing conditions. One's a very shady green, a lot of POA, actually velvet bent grass in that surface on the 5th hole, this blue line here. And then the 7th green is just right out wide open. And the nice part is those greens are kind of next to each other. There was an irrigation pump house that we put the clipping volume bucket and the recording sheet in, so you can keep everything dry. You can have that as a centralized point to take your measurements. So finding an easy way to start, kind of dip your toe in the water, I think is a great way to do this. And it maybe sounds, oh, okay, how do I measure the amount of grass? It's literally as simple as putting it in a bucket.
I really like, Carl, I really like how we bracketed it. It's like we've got, one green that's the Poa green, and that's that multiple species in the fifth green, sort of has times when it's well below, other times when it spikes up. It adds sort of the interest to knowing how site-specific management needs to be sometime. And so I want to remind everybody, right, Carl, we're not going to be here next week.
Mhm.
We're going to be in the field with Tim Hahn and his crew and the GCSANY walking around the links at Greystone. And we'll be talking BMPs there. And I bet you the superstar Rick Slattery might be in attendance as well. I know it's not that far from his house. So you may there may be a sighting of a Rick Slattery sighting. And that's always great, because once we get going about the Red Sox and the Yanks, you never know. And there we are, Rick and I, the first twosome of the day, the turkeys of the day that we'll find out there. Now, Carl, to your point about the roller coaster, here's the April up and down, right? The April up and down, up and then down. And so you go one more step into the first week of May, right? And you can see where we're heading up, right? Heading up a little bit. But we already heard this morning that for us up north, we're going to start to see a increase, but down in the downstate area and to the south of the metropolitan New York area, they're going into the cold weather again. It looks like going down into much colder than normal moving forward. So last week, we had a slightly cooler than normal week inland and a warmer than normal week, normal week along the coast, but still most places cooler than normal. Not much growing degree day accumulation to the north. And when you think about it, as we heard this morning, it's really going to flip-flop this coming week. It's going to be above normal warmth to the inland west of the Northeast region and cooler along the water. So you'll start to see a little bit more degree day accumulation overall as we start to warm, but there's still going to be nighttime temperatures in the New York metropolitan area into the 40s over the weekend. It does not look like a great Mother's Day weekend along the coast in the Northeast, but I've been told inland that my barbecue is safe for my mom, for not my mom, but my wife and her children, our children, right? So last week, a little bit dry. I think we're starting to see this now, a little starting to get some deficits everywhere, but maybe up in New Hampshire and Maine. Much of the rest of the Northeast did not get much rainfall and is starting to get into a little bit of a deficit. In fact, we had a little conversation this morning on the conference call about burn bans and how low humidity gets to be a problem in the spring around these sorts of things. Maybe a little conservative in the way they predict it, but overall, we can see some drying occurring. Now, it does look like some rainfall is going to be coming along the coast in particular, and there will be places that will get, as much as 1 to 2 inches. But in general, I think overall, we're looking at a deficit for much or right around normal for much of the region with below normal precip. So that could mean some restrictions on growth. So I'm going to get a pattern going here, Bill, about growth as I bring you on. First off is, where are the seed heads now, right? So if you've done seed head suppression, you can obviously see the benefits of where your plan worked and where it didn't work, because we're really into heavy seeding through much of the metropolitan New York area, New Jersey, up the coast of New England. Upstate still a little bit behind yet, but I would expect that to change rapidly this coming week. Now, the other thing is crabgrass. I did get some report this morning that up against a building up in Springfield in the Amherst area, there is a couple of sprigs of crabgrass coming, but generally not very much yet. And obviously, if you're using pre-emergent materials, just to remind everybody, seed head suppression, growth regulator, pre-emergent herbicide, growth regulator. Here's something that's not a growth regulator, but something you want to keep track of. Ben McGraw is saying a lot of places where downstate, especially where peak adult emergence has occurred, where the forsythias were half green and half gold. Upstate, we're still holding, waiting for peak adults. Downstate has been variable, but we're still a few weeks from those of you looking for a larvicide application. Now, a little warning from the USGA that the roller coaster temperatures are keeping these adults on the edges of closer mown turf, and that could consolidate a lot of populations and then intensify the damage if you miss them, right? So hopefully if they're all crowding in one spot, it allows an application to be more effective, but also if you miss it, it could lead to damage. Now, hopefully this is avoiding multiple applications of the same chemistries in the same spots. That's what we're trying to avoid. Now, I've started to add this little tidbit here because we are routinely going out now with insecticides, either for annual bluegrass weevil or for grubs, especially as you get downstate. So you want to be careful. We do have a fair amount of plants in flower right now. You certainly can see dandelions in various stages of flowering. So you'll want to keep track of that flowering. And hey, it's as simple as mowing it off before you're going to make an insecticide application. So hopefully you're mindful of that moving forward. The soils are still pretty cool. We did get some reports of 60 degrees down in the southern New Jersey area, but metropolitan New York is barely creeping into the 50s and into the 40s still in many areas upstate, right? So this is also going to have a suppressive effect on growth itself. Now, last week, a couple of weeks ago, we talked with Mike Fidanza about fairy rings and how some of these soil applications are being made now. It still looks like we're pretty early for summer patch treatment, looking at the 65-degree trigger for that. So again, keep in mind, a lot of these products have growth regulating properties as well. So you've got seed head suppression, you've got pre-emergent herbicides, you've got some of these early season fungicides, you've got cooler temperatures. You know, you start to look at all the things that we do using growing degree days that might have some regulating effects. And Bill, good to see you, pal. I will say, I'm sorry I caught you in between taking air in these great videos that you've been doing out at the Jim Ager golf course. Your one just the other day was brilliant and a perfect lead in, right, for what we're talking about here. I love how you say, you know, I'm going to be a little careful. So I'm going to, you know, remind everybody about this wonderful blog article that you wrote in your Greenkeeper blog recently about overregulation. Now, you can, for those of you that are, you know, frequent listeners to the program, this isn't the first time we've talked about this, especially with Bill. We've even done it in lawn systems sometimes. But Bill, you showed your tool here in Greenkeeper that I want to take a minute and talk through with you. Now, the podcast folks are not going to have, you know, be privy to necessarily seeing the images, but essentially I've got two graphs up here that are built in your Greenkeeper app, where you're essentially going through what you call a normal spring application regime in your neck of the woods out in Nebraska, which is, you know, I don't think is that substantially different from the kinds of things we might be doing here. And when you start to look at the amount of regulation that occurs in total, when you consider many of these products have growth regulation properties, you can see in the above graph here, the amount of stacking as you describe occurs. And, you know, you're approaching 80% growth regulation right around the middle of May, right, as you build this program out. And so what you've done on the lower graph is show what happens when you adjust maybe the products that you're using for some of these purposes, or the timing of when you do it. And so, Bill, that's where I want to start, pal. I'll put it on here. I'm really looking at best practices for spring PGR use, recognizing that many things have plant growth regulating properties. Let's, you know, I just classified it as, you know, products programs, the growth overall, and the transition. So as I bring you in and look at you and stop staring at the screen, good to see you, pal. Hope all's well there. Let's start with your video and what you've noticed out there, because while we've noticed the exact same things, I think, this way. One of the things I thought you said was telling, and let's start there. Weather could explain a lot of what people are seeing, independent of even a seed head suppression, right? Even a growth regulator. So let's start there. What are you seeing? And it has been up and down.
That's something that Doug Soldat and I talked about when we were working together, and we would say, it's crazy. You go out here one day and you have all these different research greens and they all look good, and then the next day they all look bad. And so they're all under very different management. And you would notice that. And so it's noticed it again this week, this spring. This spring has been kind of up and down, pretty bipolar in temperature. Is going from one extreme to the next. We're in the 40s and 50s, and then we're going to be in the upper 80s next week. And it's just, this is how it is in Nebraska. We go from winter to summer. And so I think we have a lot of similarities, honestly, to a lot of the Great Lakes, the mid Atlantic and the Northeast, because we don't have a lot of warm heat in the spring. And so we do have to be careful with what we're doing with our PGRs, because the growth rate started surging last week when we were warm and wet. And now it's gotten really cold and cloudy, and I'm watching my clipping volumes are falling off a cliff again. And so until I get some real stability in my program, until that bent grass is really actively growing and continuing to grow, I'm going to be kind of careful with what I'm doing, because we can lead to some problems if we just start willy-nilly throwing down products. And a lot of the standard spring programs can lead to a lot of overregulation if we're not careful.
And so when you see this, right, it starts with, how do you get folks off the train a little bit of saying, yeah, here's when we routinely put these things out, when they're not managing clippings, right? I mean, has it been your experience that they're having these problems when they're really not looking at their growth as closely as they need to be doing? Is that the nature? Is that where you'd start with saying to people, hey, let's start doing this first, like Carl said, let's start getting this thing, because you're literally flying blind.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the most important things that I do at Ager with our staff. We collect clippings now from 3 greens. Like Carl says, it takes 1 minute per green to do. And I do my shadiest green, my sunniest green, and one in between. And it allows me to kind of capture what's going on out there. And honestly, I don't know how you fertilize and use PGRs without having that number, right? We need to get back to what these products do, and that's suppress growth rate. And so let's use it as a tool, and not just some little like plant health product that we just throw out at the same rate interval all the time. And
but here's the point, right? The point is, even if they're good at that, maybe they've figured it out. Like you've probably heard from guys like I've heard from, I just go out every 7 days. I can't be bothered, right? Yep. I change the rate sometimes. They can't be bothered. But what about the hidden regulation of these other products? That's the thing that I think your Greenkeeper app has done such a great job in highlighting for people, that look what you're doing here. And it's like, I think in your video or in the article, you say, well, I just extended it a week and I used this product instead of that product, and it still got the same efficacy. So talk a little bit about the hidden regulation.
That picture you showed before of the golf course in the foreground, that program was a standard PGR program for that superintendent, on top of a couple of DMI fungicide applications and a couple proxy applications. Right. And so, and he knew it. Like at the end, he's like, yeah, I'm not getting any growth. It's just like, he wasn't putting those two things together until I saw that part of the back of the green that wasn't getting any proxy, or it was just getting DMI. So there was DMI there, but there was no PGRs and there was no proxy, and that area was green. And he's like, well, yeah, when they mow there, they see that growth. So a lot of these products can have these growth regulating properties. So we've built models for both cool season greens and bent grass fairways. I'm actually working on doing this in Bermuda grass right now too, for the DMI regulation, because it can be pretty high. I mean, it can be as high as 30%, 40% suppression, which is similar to a medium rate of, say, trim it. So if you start going out there with those apps, that can be real sneaky. Even that proxy is getting you 10, 15% suppression. And if we're just applying it, say, on a 2-week interval, and it's been really cool like it has been, there's a chance that we still have some proxy regulation there from the first app. And then we go out a day later and you're going to water in an application for your root diseases. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, you have 80% suppression in a period of time when the grass isn't really growing yet because it's cold.
Well, let me just throw in here. We're lucky we got bent grass surfaces. I think we're learning we could use a few more bent grass surfaces after this winter up here. How do you adjust some of these things you're saying when you've got a predominantly annual bluegrass situation? Because in your video, you're like, my POA is hurt. My bent's okay. It's not growing, but my POA is hurting. Can you talk a little bit about these programs' impacts on POA? Because guys are putting summer patch down stuff because they're trying to keep their POA.
Yeah, I think it's, the bent grass has really slowed down. Actually, the POA is still liking this weather because it has been cool and wet, and so it's growing. And so my take home there is, even though we get in this habit of thinking, I'm going to use my Class B PGRs right now, I'm going to be more aggressive on the POA, it actually really is hurting the bent grass because the bent grass really is slow to grow. And so we're actually favoring the POA because it's differential levels of suppression. You have a grass that's already growing really slowly in the bent grass and you're regulating it. And then you have the POA that's making seed, like you just showed. I'm seeing seed heads are popping. Obviously, the proxy apps this year, with the weird weather we had, weren't as effective as they are in more standard type years, at least in Nebraska. I'm seeing a lot of breakthrough.
So with that said, I've heard this before, right? Trim it's sort of nasty on the bent grass in particular, right? Would you recommend a shift to Cutlass that might not be as rough on bent grass and might still suppress POA, or you don't like Cutlass suppression of POA?
No, I'm fine with that. The nice thing about your Class Bs are your Trim It and your Cutlass. They're both pre-emergence and post-emergence type control. The Cutlass doesn't seem to have as much growth suppression as the Trim It. The Trim It really is the hammer. It's the one that I use the most in season to keep my growth rate where it needs to be because I adjust those rates all the time. But this time of year, you can go with some softer products. So the Cutlass materials would be a good option there. And it seems like from the herbicide data that with Cutlass, we see this reduction in POA, maybe not to the level of Trim It, but still the second best of the PGRs. But again, we're getting that as a side effect of not much growth suppression. So that would be an option, or going with the new would be kind of that third, and then your Primo would be kind of the weakest of all the PGRs, especially on hurting that POA. So, right now I have some Primo out there, and I'm just kind of waiting for things to happen. I'm sure I'm going to see another growth surge.
Okay, that's my question. Before you go there, you guys are expecting what we're expecting. I think, Carl, we heard it's going to be in the 80s on Wednesday, right? So how do you manage this where it's been damp, and then whoop, it's going to go like this? Is there something you would do in advance of that, or would you wait till that surge starts to happen? How is all this regulation and damping we're seeing now going to manifest itself when it actually surges?
It's a good question, and that's a part of the puzzle that we're working hard to get ahead of, and that's what like Doug Soldat's working with some of his clipping prediction models,
right?
And something that we're building into Greenkeeper right now. So if people are adding their clipping volume in Greenkeeper, it starts to learn how their grass is going to grow from this year's data, so that next year it will see, oh, there's a big warm up coming or a big rain event. Because Carl's data you showed, when we had the big rain events, we especially after a dry period, we see this growth flush. So that prediction, even if it's a week or 2 weeks in advance, is going to be helpful because we'll see, okay, growth rate's going to grow up. So before I have that model, which we'll get maybe next year with this year's data, I'm just looking at it from my past experience saying, okay, it's been very wet. It's going to get really warm. I'm going to get a big growth surge. So I'm going to go out on Monday with PGRs expecting that surge. And so I'm watching my Greenkeeper display there. And, we've been talking about growing degree to intervals for so long.
Oh my God.
But I'm kind of moving away from intervals now. With this model, you can just see the suppression. And if you need more, you can still go out on a Monday, but now you're going to see how is it going to stack? That's a term that you coined years ago when we had these talks about PGR stacking.
Yep.
And, I've continued to use that term. And so it's okay for me to stack on Monday because I know I'm going to get this growth surge out of it. And I want more suppression. And so, some of the things we talked, you showed before for in the interim, when I had this cool weather, I did a proxy by itself. Then I did proxy with a new at a low rate. Stretched it out on my growing degree day intervals. So maybe it wasn't 2 weeks, but it was like 3.5 weeks because of the cool weather. And then I decided to use some of the newer DMI products like a Densicor versus maybe a Banner or a Tourney that have a lot more suppression with them. And so I'm constantly, looking at that and figuring out how much suppression do I need? And that view in Greenkeeper really allows you to see how all those things are stacking up and then how they're going to go function in the future based on the forecast data and then the long-term based on the normals data.
Right, because it's hard for these operations sometimes to be nimble. Carl, I know you're chomping at the bit. You got a question for Bill?
Well, I think you transitioned right into it, Bill, is the forecasting element, I think is where we're going with this. And it's why it's very cool to hear you talk about forecasting clipping volumes, because, like the data I showed with Dave Hicks in the Cornell golf course, it was very reactive, right? It was, okay, today we got a little more, the next day, okay, now we're at like 20, and okay, now, and then I got to wait 5 days until my Monday, right? And this forecasting element, I think, gets that next step where now you can plan a little bit in advance instead of being a little bit more reactive, like we have been when you're just taking the data. So my question is, those models, so you're talking about learning based on field data, right? And that is maybe the best way to build these.
Yeah. So for example, like from me collecting clippings for 15, 18 years now, we know that growth rates generally really slow in June, and then they pick back up in summer when we have mineralization. And so intuitively, we start making those observations and we built that mental model. Your mental model then is increased with, okay, we have a big rainfall. That's forecasted. I'm going to get ahead of it with PGRs, right? So what we're doing with Greenkeeper and with Doug's just finished his PhD student through is, let's let the computers figure out all those crazy different, okay, the temperature is like this, and it's this time of year, and it's this grass species. Let it kind of learn. So all you have to do is just put in your clipping volumes and let Greenkeeper track what PGRs did you use, what fertilizers, what was the weather like, what time of year was it, and it will start to then learn. And then the more data you put in, the better the model gets over and over. So it's just moving to the next level.
And at the same time, Bill, right, this is what Carl, this is what he figured out from hanging out with Dave, right? You got to spend a fair amount of time with Dave to get that range nailed down with him. I love him to death, my brother. But, getting that range and performance is part of it, right? So you can put performance data into Greenkeeper as well. Are you able to tie in growth regulation, clipping volume, and ball roll?
Yeah, we're actually putting ball roll model. I hired my old PhD student, just finished a couple of weeks ago, and that's one of the things we're going to work on, so that say you're a superintendent and you have a tournament in a week and you need your greens to be rolling 12. Greenkeeper would say, okay, well, you're going to need to mow every day and roll 12 times in the next 2 weeks to get to that level. And your quality then is going to do this, right? It's things that we're already doing in our head. Like our greens need to be faster. We're going to start double rolling. But now it's just saying, well, how many times do I have to double roll? Or does it make sense to mow in the evening or not? And so that's what we're trying to do with this. So if you can the more data you can feed into the site, the better it's going to be at predicting these types of things.
Bill, it always goes too fast, pal. It's great to see you.
Yep.
Carl, final comments from the live audience, or you want to get us out of here?
I'll get one more question in, Bill. And I think for people listening who haven't ever collected clipping volume, and maybe they've heard about it and they go, they got their own mental model. What's your pitch to saying, hey, here's why you should do this data? And I know we're talking about these models and they're going to predict what ball roll is, and people in their heads are like, wow, I know how to do that. What's your pitch to those guys?
So right now, if you track, first of all, it prevents people from being too reactive to seeing that the growth rate was really high in one particular day. And so if you're looking at it as a written down data series, you can actually see, are you trending up or down, right? So that's an important thing. And then the other part is, if you keep track of your clipping volume for the whole year, we can make really nice assessments of how much nutrient was mowed off, right? And so by balancing those two things, you're actually gaining some better perspective over an entire year in terms of where your growth is going within maybe the next week or 2 weeks, but then also how much fertilizer did you mow off, and did you at least put somewhere near that back down or not? And so I think that gives another level of visibility that you just don't have without tracking these data.
I think it would be virtually impossible, Bill, to find someone who knows more about plant growth regulators than you do. It's always great to see you. I just love this. I love how it's coming to these hidden growth regulators, because that's where I've consistently seen guys get in trouble, especially in the spring, with the cavalcade of products that we get pushed to use for the variety of problems we think we might face. So good to see you again, Bill. Thanks a lot for joining us, Carl. We got to get out of here. It's 32 minutes.
Thanks to Bill. Thanks for jumping on today. Tomorrow, our episode will feature John Sorokin of Tennessee. We'll be chatting sports turf. Just one more reminder, we're not on next week's episode. We're going to be in the field up in Rochester. So if you're around us, feel free to sign up for that GCS NY event, but no golf episode next week. We'll see you guys tomorrow.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.